In 1 minute, just waiting for everyone to join. All right, welcome everyone to our second session of our Decolonizing Global Health series titled The Role of Religion and Culture in Shaping Global Health. This has been a tremendous week. We celebrated a civil rights leader's birthday, Martin Luther King, yesterday. We're going to have a transition in power in the United States tomorrow, and hopefully the end of Trumpism. And really just appreciate you, despite all this, taking the time to really learn about this timely topic about decolonization. So my name's Parmi Sachdev. I'm the Associate Director of the Emory Global Health Institute, and we're the focal point for global health at Emory. And one of our goals is to really connect the different disciplines that contribute to global health. And I can't think of a more multidisciplinary panel that we have with us today. So before we launch into the introduction of the moderator and the session, I wanted to just give you a brief overview of the series and why we decided to do this at Emory. So first of all, we want to really acknowledge the Eurocentric conception of fabricated class, caste, religious, and ethnic superiority. And really our goal is to work collectively to dismantle some of these hierarchies and rebalance global health. And so this is an ambitious goal, and we're trying to do this through really a series of 5 sessions. This is our second of 5, and we have 3 more planned in the upcoming months, and really hope you'll register for those too to continue this discussion. And our disclaimer is that really we can't cover the immense depth of these topics. There's volumes that have been written and books and volumes and classes, and also that these conversations may be uncomfortable for some, and we want to acknowledge that as well. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge our planning group members as well for their work in putting these series together. So with that, I will, I think our moderator is having some technical difficulties, so I will take it on and start the moderation. And if our moderator can join later, the moderator will fill in. So with that, I'd like to start with just introducing our 3 panelists today, who are going to give us take us on a bit of journey of the role of religion and culture in both global health historically, but also global health today. So our first speaker will be Dr. Pushpa Parekh, who is the chair of African Diaspora and the World Program at Spelman College. And she's a professor of English, and we're really fortunate to have her joining us, and is also increasing our collaboration with Spelman College, which is fabulous. After Dr. Parekh, we will have Professor Abdu Ahmed Nahim, who's the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Emory Law. He's also a professor in Emory College and is a senior fellow in the Center for Study of Law and Religion. And Dr. Abdu is an expert in many areas, both in law, but also religion and Islam, and has also written a recent book, which he'll be telling us a little bit about as well. And last but not least, we'll have Dr. John Blevins, who's an associate research professor and the director of the Interfaith Health Program at the Rollins School of Public Health here at Emory University. He's also actively involved in a large study in Africa and South Asia, looking at causes of under 5 child mortality, and looking at some of the social and behavioral conditions, and conducting a large study like that. And so he will continue our journey in his discussions as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Parekh to start us on this journey. And then, sorry, one other thing is as each speaker will present, and we ask you to insert your questions in the chat box, and then we'll get to those at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Parekh.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Sachdev. This is Pushpa. Parekh. And as Parmi just introduced me, I'll just add a few points that I say when I introduce myself. And one is that I'm originally from India, but I've lived in this country in the US for last 40 years or so. That tells me that that I am an American citizen in some ways, but I straddle cultures. Another point I want to make, and I have talked about this in some of my writings, is I identify as a person with disability. And so I insert that category in discussions about culture and also about identity. So with that, I will just get started with my PowerPoint to keep on time. Um, so here I'm going to be introducing and talking about what is decolonizing thought. And of course it ranges and it's varied in different disciplines. We talk about it in different ways. Academia talks about it and probably focuses on some aspects differently than people who are activists and what they emphasize. So with that, I just want to say that decolonizing thought exists both in a theory, particularly in academia, but practice, I would say, mostly in the ways in which we teach and interact, but also in the field of activism, in ideology constructions, and it has various academic manifestations and in different disciplines, but they can be both convergent or divergent in how they talk about the effects and implications of decolonizing thought. So with the concept of the decolonial, I want to focus on an area of study that I do, which is post-colonial studies and related to cultural and activist movements. So next slide. The point I want to make, and this is connected with the work that I'm talking about in tandem with what I do in English department, is work that I published as editor recently, and that is Frontiers and Frameworks in African Diaspora Teaching and Scholarship in the Journal of Global Postcolonial Studies. And it just came out in spring issue 2020. And it addresses key issues of transforming the educational and academic practices in shaping our students, future scholars, and community builders. I also want to make sure that when I speak about my English courses, which I will give examples from, I'm also talking about being cognizant of the decolonial as both a persistence of the colonial and a transformation and a deconstruction of that ideology, practice, and thinking. But we also have to be aware that the colonial hangover or internalized colonialism or neocolonialism still persists, and we all have to look inside ourselves to see those, spaces where we need to still decolonize ourselves. So going on, next slide, please. So what I do with my students when I teach is really grapple with concepts and terms, and especially the framing concepts and terms. And in this particular session, I want to do the same. Not that I think of you as students, but I think that is the best way I can engage with these topics. First of all, the concept of the colonial and decolonial, the concept of global health, and the concept of cultural critical lens. Next. So what I am really looking at when I talk about colonial and decolonial is the politics of domination. And this occurs at different levels. And what I am really concerned about is ways in which this politics of domination shows up in literary works, because I do teach literature, but we also do in ADW program, we have two courses These are first year courses. We call them African Diaspora in the World 111 and 112, where we look at the structures of domination. So when I think about this politics of domination and how it persists and continues to morph into different forms, I am also aware that this concept of the colonial slash decolonial, it puts us in a conceptual conundrum. And I just shared with you what that is, that the fact that we are not only dealing with an unfinished present with regard to the decolonization project, but also uh, future imaginings of what decolonization will look like. And thirdly, I want to think about in terms of how do we situate ourselves? And this kind of makes me think about ways in which I was introduced to literature, British literature in India. And I was studying modernism, and oftentimes the idea of what was happening in the West in terms of modernism was universalized. And I just wanted to make sure that we don't do the same thing with colonization and the ideas permeating within colonization, that we don't think of them as rational and modern only. There are different ways of being modern, and that's what I want to place myself in that context. Next slide. So with global health, I think that it is best for us to dialogue on this phenomenon and the field and the practice, because I'm not an expert on global health, but I do teach it in relationship to the text that I focus on. So these inquiries are necessary steps in decolonizing what I see as current manifestations of power and knowledge. For example, I'm thinking of two related questions. One is the global in global health understood to be universal or pluriversal? And by universal, I'm kind of saying it's kind of a homogenizing practice and a discourse that I want to move away from. And if it's so, then the global cannot be simply a way for non-Western countries to become Western or adopt the Western way. It has to be that we realize and give value to pluriversal notions of global health. And the last question that I had is, what are the social cultural determinants of health? I know that there's a lot of examination of race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, national identity, of course, a religion, as we are doing in this particular session. But I want to really open it up and discuss this in connection with how people from different social cultural contexts understand health to be. Next slide. So my cultural critical lens that I use in my courses and in my scholarship really makes me say or ask this question: what could a decolonial cultural critical approach to global health do to critique and disrupt power and knowledge asymmetries? And secondly, I want to ask, how do I practice this approach in my teaching? I constantly keep, reading a lot of stuff that's coming out, but I also want to see where are these examples that from the readings that my students do, and I teach at Spelman College, how do they impact them as students, as Black women who are going to make a change, as we claim they are going to go out into the world and bring about change. I hope, systemic change that is needed. Next slide. So we do talk about, as Spelman, about the social justice framework that many of us embrace and theories of intersectionality. And of course, if you all know, Kimberly Crenshaw introduced the term intersectionality in her essay that she wrote in 1991. to really, it is within the context of critical race theory. And I use these frameworks and these theories in relationship to my courses and texts that I introduce: English 433, which is post-colonial theory and women's literature, new US immigrant women's literature, and a course on contemporary India literature and the political. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm trying to give you some examples here of how I discuss with my students and ask them to think about these categories of identity and social constructs that we need to examine. And these, in relationship to the text that I'm teaching, are disability, race, ethnicity, gender, nationality. And here are a few works, for example, like AIDS Sutra, Mahasweta Devi's Imaginary Maps, and Sidhwa's Cracking India. AIDS Sutra, Untold Stories from India, is something that I started using just recently. And it has opened up a lot of discussion about health issues. But Imaginary Maps also introduces this topic in connection with independence struggles, but from the viewpoint of we call the people marginalized in India. So we are talking about intra, connections, intra relationships within groups. And Mahasweta Devi's work really focuses on the tribal groups that, for lack of a better word, I'm using that term, but who are the originary, people of India. Bapsisit's Cracking India focuses on partition and the struggles, and centers on a young girl, Lenny, who really questions the issues because she's like me, a young girl who had polio, and how that particular identity category is not necessarily what I would say a negative category, because that allows her to cross class lines because she is taken by her ayah across the boundaries of class. So these are some of the topics that I'm introducing in my classes, and we discuss these. Second slide, please.
Dr. Park, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay. So I won't go over all of these, but these are some of the intersections of identities that I have asked, and students introduce their own identity categories that they think are important. So class, age is another category, a set of categories that I talk about in relationship to ethnicity, nationality, and race. Okay, next one. Okay, caste is particularly resonant in the works from Indian writers. The grip of change is powerful, and so is the God of small things. Next slide. And these are just, I just love the covers, book covers, so I just thought you would like to see some of that. Second, next one. Okay, collections and readers that I've used. These also are very important because we get to see the connections to these topics and themes, especially about social justice issues. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, Dr. Kwame Kalimara and ADW faculty who I work with suggested a few ways in which she has participated that may be useful for us to talk about. And I'll just say that this has been a project and it is an ongoing project between Morehouse, Spelman College, but also Prometra, which is, next slide, which is Prometra International NGO in Dakar, Senegal. And it really brings or bridges traditional knowledge with modern medicine. Going on next. There are a few books here that are useful for reading further in this area. medical apartheid, the dark history of medical experimentation of Black Americans from colonial times to the present, and unequal treatment confronting racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare. Next slide. And this is the last piece that I just drew a lot that I've already written about in a piece that was published in 2007 and republished as a book. It's called Intersecting Gender and Disability Perspectives and Rethinking Post-Colonial Identity. So I'll refer you to that and I won't take up more time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I'd like to just introduce the Vice President for Global Health here at Emory, Dr. Jeffrey Copeland, and my boss, who will take it over as the moderator. Thank you.
Thanks, Parmi, and thank you very much, Professor Parekh, for that in-depth, concentrated and concise presentation. The next speaker is Abdu, Professor An-Naim from the law school, where he's Candler Professor there, distinguished scholar in this field, and the author of a recent book on decolonization of human rights, a new book coming out in the Cambridge University Press. So I'll turn it over to Abdu.
Thank you very much. I am from Sudan, and I'm a Muslim. So I'm an African Muslim from Sudan. And I used to just say that, and that was enough. But now I have to explain, am I of the North or the South? And here you see that how the process of decolonization actually never ends. That is always new frontiers to cross, new ideas to decipher, and therefore it is a very rich and very personal field of study and reflection. I'm an activist, both as a Muslim and as a human rights activist. And in both fronts, I encountered these issues quite intimately. If you may allow me just to start with a couple of points which are quite jarring, actually, when you think of it. When I came to Georgia, to Atlanta in 1995 to join Emory faculty, there were some people in the prisons of Georgia who were there because they were homosexuals. So you see, but the point is being how recent what we are talking about is, and in terms of race and gender and sexuality and all sorts of issues that are now common discourse, but until recently they were not. If you go globally, then you'll see that the contrasts are even more stronger and more resonate with all types of situations. But of course, the thing is that we should not assume that the local is just simply being expanded into the global proportionately, that we just simply push from each side and we end up with a global vision or imaginary of what we are talking about. Because things have their own life and their own way of thinking about how to develop, how to evolve, and it is never going to be the same. I mentioned this to caution us in talking about religion. Christianity is just one of the numerous religions that human beings have. And even within Christianity, within Islam, and within Hinduism and others, there is also tremendous contestation of what it is to be religious and what it is to be, whether it's the Muslim or a Christian and so on. And this is both a field of possibilities and a field of confusion. Possibilities because for those who care, we can expand our knowledge and understanding of the phenomena almost indefinitely. But at the same time, we tend to approximate I don't know if this word, I just thought of it. I don't know if it's a proper word. By approximate, I mean the tendency to say Christianity has this, Islam has that, therefore they must both be this or the other. Or to say Hinduism does not, therefore Hinduism is not a religion or is a religion. In other words, that we tend to expand our limited understanding of a single phenomena into a global view and perspective, which is, of course, as you can imagine, quite destructive and are not very helpful in our conversations. Therefore, the term religion and culture is used in the title of the study, and it makes sense for the people who imagine that study, but it may not make sense to many people who are religious or who don't understand quite clearly what it is to be of a certain cultural identity or not. All of this is just simply to point to the complexity of the subject, and therefore the possibilities of understanding it in different ways. The term decolonize also is something that to be visited very closely, because it assumes as a rationality and a process of inclusion, so that as if all the colonized peoples of the world are brought about in order to imagine how decolonization might be and how they can determine their own type of identities in that process. But of course, in fact, by its nature, colonization is not voluntary and is not quite compassionate or understanding. It is not motivated by whatever humane motivation that we may imagine for this current project. And therefore, the question about the nature of colonialism and colonization and how people need to be very cautious about speaking of these issues should something that we should all be aware of, and so on. The book that I think Jeffrey mentioned is a book called Decolonizing Human Rights. And my sense is that, of course, the book turned out to be quite different from what I originally imagined, and it is driving me in all sorts of directions. But the point that I find useful is that I discovered angles and corners of tension and contestation and struggle that I was not aware of. And that's always to be celebrated, I think. That we should never take things for granted or assume them to be this or the other. For me, and I will just briefly end by this personal narrative, I am an activist about human rights and about Islam since the 1960s, when I was a student at the University of Khartoum in Sudan. And I have been teaching and traveling and integrating all sorts of perspectives into my worldview. But when I started, and you would be surprised, maybe some of you may, that as an African Muslim, I start by being suspicious about Sharia. And by the way, if you don't mind, I prefer the term Sharia to Islamic law, because it is not law. And therefore calling it Islamic law is really a distraction. So long as people can understand, I think the term has become familiar enough that people can conceptualize or imagine it without having to use a North American or West European terminology for it. So the point is that decolonization assumes a deliberate, reflective, voluntary process. And of course, it is none of the above. And often that we have no choice in the timing or in the manner or in the consequences or in every aspect of the subject. Because we were not colonized voluntarily, and now we are not being decolonized voluntarily. And here I may sound hostile to the idea of the project, but yes, I tend to do that. because too much is at stake. And we have been through so many tragedies and civil wars and devastation that we should never immediately surrender into the field of quote unquote science or social science or and assume that we are in safe environment. But in fact, everything that we know about these subjects can change quite quickly, I think, and almost tragically sometimes, if we just reflect a little bit on what happened with colonization and colonialism, and what happened with religion and colonialism, what happened with culture and colonialism. And these questions are very helpful to have. But the point for me, going back to my narrative, I started as a human rights activist. And of course, for me, confronting Sharia was the highest priority. Someone from Sudan, where still we are struggling with these issues 70 years after independence. But still, it is very important that we come to some sort of understanding of what it is that we are talking about. So I took human rights for granted. Of course, it came out of the United Nations. It was drafted by experts after the Second World War who were motivated by that slogan of never again, that it's a question of how to control and to regulate and to punish crimes like genocide and so on. But in fact, in due course, I came to question human rights too, because the idea of universality of human rights is a very attractive idea, that it is something that we can all agree about, that we can all act on collectively. But of course, issues of power relations, issues of how terms are invented and sometimes really manipulated in the process of colonization and decolonization, we have to be careful about that too. So now at this point, 40, 50 years after I started, I am suspicious of human rights and I'm suspicious of religion. In my case, specifically Islam. But my relationship to both is so fundamental to who I am that I can't imagine myself sort of being decolonized from these values or systems. So I'm not for decolonization for its own sake. I'm for decolonization that enhances my agency, my ability to decide what to do with my life, what to do with the good I can bring to other people, and also what to do with the pain and damage that I can bring to other people too. So these are the thoughts I thought might be helpful for those of us who are continuing with this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdul. That very complex topic, and your introduction, your perspective, your own background makes you a unique professor and teacher for this topic area. Finishing up our panel of three is John Blevins, who is, as introduced already, is an associate professor at the Rollins School of Public Health. And he's going to provide a slightly different religious and cultural perspective with a different time and locale focus. John?
Thanks, Jeff. I am going to present today a historical case study of the influence of religion, specifically American Protestant Christianity, on the establishment of the field of global health, and to do that in the context of a movement in America in the early decades of the 20th century called the social gospel, and how it influenced the work of the Rockefeller family and the Rockefeller Foundation. I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to stop my camera and pull up the PowerPoint. I'll go through the PowerPoint and then bring my camera back on for the discussion that follows. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. I want to go through three key messages today. First, I want to describe how this particular form of American Christianity had a historical influence in establishing present-day institutions and priorities in the field of global health, and to do that, as I said, in the context of the Rockefeller family. And then I want to identify in brief ways the role that colonialism at that point in time and capitalism at that point in time played in that social religious history in the early decades up through the latter decades of the 20th century. And then I want to move from the past into the present to ask in what ways are these ongoing social, political, and economic interests, the social political force of neocolonialist kinds of impulses and movements, and the economic influences of present-day global capitalism, what role do they play as an ongoing influence in global health and development practice for us today? So the first element, as I said, is to discuss the social gospel and the Rockefeller Family Foundation and its influence not only through the foundation, but on the subsequent generation of global health leaders and programs in the late 20th and early 21st century. To do that, I need to tell you briefly what the social gospel is. Proponents of the social gospel among American Christians believe that their faith called them to be involved, bringing about God's coming kingdom on earth, and to bring that kingdom to fruition, to further it through their efforts to encourage human betterment and human flourishing. The social gospel, which was hugely influential among liberal Protestant Christians in America in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, played an essential role in a number of progressive social movements of that time, including universal education, the establishment of social institutions such as public libraries in support of that education, the women's suffrage movement, a variety of social service programs for urban and rural communities across the United States that were living in poverty, and most important to the issue of public health and global health, the expansion of health services. This perspective wasn't simply fundamental in establishing these kinds of movements and programs in the United States. The movement also changed common perceptions of global missions and how Christians in the United States at that time understood the global missions enterprise to no longer be primarily focused, at least for those who were influenced by the social gospel, on conversion to Christianity, but to provide a foundation and a reason for focusing on health, education, and social and economic development programs. John D. Rockefeller, as I mentioned, the Rockefeller as a family, as I mentioned, played a key role in this. John D. Rockefeller at the close of the 20th centuries was the richest man in the world with a net worth in 2020 dollars that would be about 3 times the worth of Bill Gates today. He was an active layperson in his local Protestant, in this instance Baptist congregation, first in Cleveland, Ohio, and then later in New York City when he moved there. And he was also a fierce advocate of the social gospel. Rockefeller played a key role in establishing the American Research University and in establishing the field of public health and its global institutions. His influence on global health really is astounding. Through him, his son, and his grandson, and the foundation that they established under the influence of the motivating force of the social gospel, we see the role that they played. In regard to higher education, the Rockefellers, through the foundation, established the founding endowment for the University of Chicago with essential funding to over 35 different American colleges and universities, including a variety of historically Black colleges and universities. For interest of our local Atlanta context, that includes 3 of the 4 institutions of the Atlanta University Center. Spelman College, one of the constituent colleges of the AU Center, was named for John D. Rockefeller's wife's maternal, her parents. That was her maiden name. Spelman was her maiden name. So Spelman is named not for a Black religious or community leader from the time, but for the parents of Rockefeller's wife, Laura. And Morehouse is the name of the head of the American Baptist Mission Society, reflecting both Rockefeller's Baptist faith and tradition, as well as his understanding of the importance of mission through the lens of the social gospel. Rockefeller also funded a variety of public health institutions. In the 1930s, public health became a primary focus of the foundation, and it provided founding endowments for 24 schools of public health all around the world, including those at Harvard, the University of Michigan, Johns Hopkins, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And so you see these seals of these kinds of educational institutions that the foundation and the family helped to endow and to establish. But it wasn't just in the field of education that the Rockefeller family and the foundation played a role. Rockefeller funded an organization beginning in 1913 called the Chinese Medical Board, which led to the establishment of the first medical schools in the nation of China. Both schools could only be established through the capacity that had been set in place by medical missionaries. This is a quote from the founding directors of the foundation in relation to the founding of the Chinese Medical Board. We are thinking of the interest of China as a whole. Will you join us and make a happy combination and be as keen on Christianity as we are on medical science? The foundation has the financial resources with which to do in laboratory, classroom, and hospital what no one board nor a half dozen boards with their obligations could possibly do. Scientifically qualified men are required, but Christian men of equal qualifications are preferred. Let men offer for such service, secure the best preparation that there is to be had, and train a body of Chinese physicians and surgeons who can in turn not only man mission and government hospitals, but become the influential factors for moral Christian purity and religious life in the institutions of the country. The Rockefellers and the foundation were not only pivotal in establishing these schools of public health and these kinds of public health entities and organizations, such as the Chinese Medical Board. They were also pivotal in establishing the League of Nations Health Organization, the precursor body to the World Health Organization, and they provided the majority of the operating budget for the League of Nations Health Organization throughout the Depression. The foundation also led in establishing the WHO when the UN itself was established in 1945. Their relationship to the United Nations extended also beyond the World Health Organization, with the family donating the land on the east side of Midtown Manhattan, where the United Nations Secretariat now sits. In the area of global development initiatives, Nelson Rockefeller, who was the son of John Jr. and the grandson of John Sr., Nelson would go on to be the governor of New York and eventually the vice president of the United States under Gerald R. Ford. Nelson Rockefeller helped to make the case to then President Harry Truman for the establishment of the United States Agency for International Development. Truman articulated that vision in his inauguration speech of 1949, commonly known as the Point Four speech. In making the case to the president, then President Truman, Rockefeller stated, quote, "The types of AIDS programs I propose originated with Christian missionaries in the late 19th century. These individuals preached the gospel of modern science and medicine as well as that of Christ. My grandfather, John D. Rockefeller Sr., the greatest supporters of missionaries in this generation, expanded this tradition with the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation, the first significant private non-sectarian institution to provide assistance in medicine and public health to developing nations. Through your efforts, we can make that tradition an accepted part of the U.S. foreign policy establishment," end quote. And these are just three photographs. One in the middle is obviously the United Nations Secretariat building in New York. The one on the left is Truman's 1949 speech in which he laid out and called for the establishment of U.S. aid. And the one on the right is the photograph taken at the establishment of the Chinese Medical College of the Chinese Medical Board in 1921. The institutional capacity and the overall influence of Christianity in global health under the Rockefellers was seen in global health leadership in the 70s and even up until today. And I just want to give three examples of that from three men who offer that picture: Jim Grant, Bill Foege, and Houghton Mahler. Jim Grant is the person on the left-hand side in this slide. He served as the director of UNICEF from 1980 until his death in 95. Under Grant's leadership, UNICEF adopted specific measurable strategies to increase global rates of childhood immunization from 20% when he took over to over 85% in only 6 years. In 94, Grant was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Clinton. Jim Grant's grandfather, James Skiffington Grant, was from New Brunswick, Canada, and was jointly appointed as a medical missionary to China by both the Canadian Baptist Missionary Organization and the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society. Jim's father, Skiffington's son, John Block Grant, was born in China, but returned to Canada and then to the United States for college, medical school, and finally the public health program at Johns Hopkins. After a few stints on public health in the US, he returned to China with the Rockefellers and with the foundation, where he served as a professor in public health at Peking Union Medical College in the university founded by the foundation, drawing on the family's commitments to medical mission. So Jim was the third generation in his family to call China home. His family's generational commitments to public health practices that were embedded in Christian foreign missions, influenced Grant's priorities at UNICEF. And in partnership with Bill Foege, the efforts through UNICEF to immunize children around the world fundamentally changed childhood morbidity and mortality worldwide. That partnership also led to the founding of the Task Force for Childhood Survival, today the Task Force for Global Health, which is headquartered just down the street from Emory in downtown Decatur. That turns us to Bill Foege. Foege played a key role in smallpox eradication, spearheading the CDC's global campaign in the early 70s. First under Carter and then under President Reagan, Foege served as the director of the CDC and then as the executive director of the Carter Center. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012 by President Obama. Bill was also the son of a Lutheran pastor, the nephew of a medical missionary, and served as a medical missionary himself. He recounts the role of medical missionary movements and the importance of that work, both in Liberia and in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa in particular, in his memoir, where he speaks about the eradication of smallpox, House on Fire, the fight to eradicate smallpox. And then our third example is Houghton Mahler, who was the third Director General of the WHO. Mahler was a key advocate for a wholesale shift in global health priorities that would focus not on the technical expertise of outsiders, but on the health capacities and resources of local communities to set their own health priorities. This model that we all know as the primary healthcare movement reflected the institutional priorities and commitments of the WHO under Mahler's tenure. Houghton Mahler was the son of a Danish Baptist preacher, a man whom he called, and this is his own quote, one of the harshest prophets of doom in this century in Denmark. Mahler himself considered becoming a Baptist pastor during his adolescence, and he began preaching in local Baptist congregations across Northern Europe when he was 15, but eventually opted for a career in medicine and from there on his career in global health. He championed the work of the Christian Medical Commission of the World Council of Churches, an organization and a movement which actually was an important source for some of the articulation of the earliest priorities and objectives of primary health care. And for 6 years, while he served as director of WHO, he integrated primary health care into all of its programs. So Jim Grant.
John, we're going to have to wrap it up about a minute.
Okay. So they are examples of public health leaders that are influenced by American Protestant Christianity. I don't presume to know their own personal convictions, but I do argue that religion, specifically Protestant Christianity, played a key role in determining the specific shape and context of their public health practice. But that's not the only kind of Christianity that played out. I think it's important to name, and I'll do this quite quickly, that at the same time and in the antecedent years before the social gospel, American Christianity was impacted and influenced by colonialist impulses and influences. This is a quote from 1800 by a Protestant pastor, Nathaniel Emmons, who speaks uncritically and actually in an affirmative way of the role of America in becoming the new seat of empire globally, and the seat of empire of American Christianity to be the action of God's providence in the world, so that as other nations diminish, America and American exceptionalism could flourish through the practices of empire. And so the kind of impulse of humanitarian support that the social gospel lays out also references and is reflected and impacted by another form of Christianity in the United States throughout its history, a form of Christianity that ties religious devotion and religious belief to an unkind of critical idea of American exceptionalism, and the idea that that's made real and made manifest at social and political levels in relation to colonizing impulses, influence, programs, and policies. The question I have for us and would like to put in front of us today is, what does global health and development look like today? If we think that religion is this dual-sided coin by which it can be a motivator for humanitarian impulses and also a motivator for social, political, and economic power that references colonialist influences, in what ways is it a practice of those political, social forces of what Dr. Perret called the politics of domination? And in what ways is it a counter practice to that? And I guess the question for us as a school of public health and a university, and for other schools of public health and universities, to what extent are we equipping our students to be global health and development practitioners or counter practitioners? Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank all three speakers. We've straddled the continents, and we've had input from work being done and thoughts being made from Africa to India to Asia in general, the China Medical Board. Just a couple of notes to add to John's comment. The China Medical Board now has its headquarters in Atlanta with an association with Emory. And there are no vestiges of the Baptist roots of the board currently, but the institutions that were put together in the early 20th century are alive, well, and thriving. And in fact, the Peking Union Medical College Hospital has its 100th anniversary this coming year. So lots to think about, lots to talk about here. Let's take some of the questions that have come in. We have one question, and if it's okay, I won't give the name of the questioner, but unless they want it in. But a question for Abda is, quote, "I think Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam are not homegrown in Asia and Africa as part of colonialism. If we want to decolonize, we need to address the issues eventually. What is your comments on this?" You need to unmute, Abda.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we certainly can. Good.
I would say that all religions are colonial ideologies, because it's about power, it's about cultivating political institutions and legal process. So it is not as if some are innocent, others are guilty, but it's all ultimately because it's the human in all of these institutions. I think we tend to forget that, in fact, the human agency of the believer is the driving force for all religions. And we have heard now stories about how certain types of imperial religion has evolved out of the conviction and drive of particular people who had the resources. But then it makes you wonder about, where do they get the resources to begin with? So it is, if I may, my response to the comment is that, yes, All religions are that, including Islam, Christianity, Hinduism. None is innocent, but also that none is permanently in one state or the other. Islam was a colonial religion for centuries, and it has now been colonized for centuries. And we should see the historical depths of these phenomena and understand where they come from. Just one word to say is that there is a major human agent in every religion. That is, it is not religion as an autonomous divine ordination that comes from heaven. It grows up from the ground and rejoins heaven for those who believe that there is a heaven to rejoin. So I think I would caution that we should be very skeptical about religious ventures and adventures, and understand that we have to deal with the human in all of these phenomena.
Thank you. Very good. Another question. Can you talk about the Gates Foundation and the role of religion in it? You've mentioned a number of people who come from a long religious background and with its own links to colonialism. How do you perceive the Gates Foundation as function? And any of you three, please take that on.
I'll start. I do not think the Gates Foundation is as overtly religious in its motivations and in its rhetoric about its motivations as the Rockefeller Foundation was in its founding. And then again, the Rockefeller Foundation isn't today in the same ways. But I don't think that that is necessarily evidence that religion's influence and power is marginalized. I would wonder to what extent it might be more useful to us to think about how, in a kind of framework of secularization and secularism, which has its own kinds of problems, some of what Pushpa described in regard to the idea of universals that obscure context and differences, and that's a hallmark of secularism, that the influence of religion in the Gates Foundation and in the field in general today is one by what the French cultural critic Michel Foucault described as a Christianization in depth. And that is that it's really hard for us to think out of Western cultural context what humanitarian impulses look like, including efforts in public health and global health, without reference to a frame that Christianity as a social force made possible. I'm not making a theological argument there that Christianity is preferential or the best way to do that. I'm making a social political claim that it played a role in the institutions of society telling us what humanitarianism looks like. So I don't think the Gates Foundation so often references religion. To the extent it does so in ways that many public health programs and movements today do in a very instrumentalist way. It talks about partnerships with local faith communities or local religious leaders in support of what it wants to achieve and accomplish and carry out. And that's its own kind of a dangerous enterprise. Even though I'm part of some efforts through that very foundation to do that kind of work of taking religion and trying to put it in alignment with what you want to achieve in an unkind of critical way. So religion doesn't necessarily look the same at all for the Gates Foundation as it did for Rockefeller, but I think it's still powerful.
Good. One of the questions is, where can one find this discussion after our seminar is over here? And the answer is on the Emory Global Health Institute website. We'll have an access to it there.
Could I just say one
Sure.
word or a few words in response to the question that about Gates Foundation and the connection? I just want to emphasize the fact that most of us are rooted in our own cultures and traditions and practices. But as we establish institutions, or we work in them, or we interact with other groups from different countries and their institutions, there needs to be this kind of conversation that we establish, which respects and places everyone on an equal footing. That is, I think, the future for decolonial forms of global health. And Melinda Gates really put it well when she talked about time poverty in many parts of the developing world and how we cannot really just simply impose certain things that are taken for granted as social cultural practices in the West into, you know, parts of the world that are impacted by gender gap and other gaps that have to be addressed as well. So I think it is this movement that is important, and I want to just emphasize because there is something to say about wherever we come from. She was, of course, we know Melinda Gates is Catholic in her beliefs. And it's not simply that her Catholicism, but her learning beyond Catholicism that has influenced her work with Melinda and Bill Gates' work. I just wanted to make a point about that. Thank you. You're muted, Jeff. You're still muted, as I can see.
Okay, finally, yes, I think that someone didn't like the question and tried to mute me from asking it, but I'll ask it anyways. Well, how do you three feel about imbalance? So the social gospel, as John described it, has our interest in global health has, and the religious and cultural forces behind that, has it done more harm than good? Is it about an equal 50-50? Are there times when it's been a positive, useful thing, but then other times when it hasn't? How do you view this field and its title, and how do we make it as effective as possible in terms of doing good things for the right people, with the right people being empowered?
If I may, I invest a lot in human agency. That's the ability of people to transform whatever framework or set of beliefs or ideology that they inhabit, sorry. So that, in other words, never give up on the possibility of transformation and change, but never assume that it will just happen because God wanted it to happen. I'm sure that God did, but God did through our agency as human beings, and not beyond that, just simply in an arbitrary manner. The point, I think, also that we should not allow the recent experiences to hide or to hinder our vision of the deeper, more profound, ancient forces and struggles that we see around the world. So in other words, it is a question of taking religion for what it is, honestly, intellectually and emotionally, ideologically. I think we should do that, but then realize that it doesn't have to end that way. It's not going to end anyway, but we might as well ride it as long as we can to transform our communities with.
Good, thank you. One of the participants has less a question, but just notes that the Tata Foundation and the Aga Khan Foundation can be looked at as examples of other endeavors focused on global health and education with a religious and cultural perspective that's complementary.
I think what's interesting in relation to the Aga Khan Foundation is there have been a number of debates with leadership of the foundation, both its educational initiatives and its health initiatives in the field of religion and public health as to whether they are representatives of or part of faith-based organizations. They're examples of faith-based organizations. And there's been a real kind of push back on the part of the foundation and its programs to say that they're not. They've eventually, through some debate that was at Georgetown University on online lectures or in-person lectures at the time, come to agree that they're faith inspired. But the idea of being a faith-based organization was politically something that from the political perspective of their own social, political, and geographic context, they wanted to reject. And so part of what I think is on the table is that when we look at religion and we look at kind of who religious actors are in the global health field, we often do so through a lens and a bias of Western culture. And Christianity is the religious expression of that. And a lot of influences of religion on health and development programs, practices at large levels and at local levels doesn't look like what we are biased to see when we look through a Western lens. And the example of Aga Khan and its influence is one example of that.
Good. Any other comments from the panelists on that? One of the questions is, for those of us who consider ourselves as, quote, global health practitioners, end quote, how would the speakers propose we approach decolonizing global health? How should we be thinking about approaching it and doing or undoing it?
I think if I could speak to a part of it that I addressed, one of the ways is, of course, this dialogical kind of approach, which dismantles one way of thinking about global health as the only way. And I think that is what I believe Prometra International and many other organizations and NGOs like Woman to Woman are trying to do internationally, are really to, and Sister Love as well, because that's started from Spelman College. So many of these organizations are trying to rethink the Western focus on medicine and health as a biogenetic kind of a physiological concept, and rethink in terms of the places where health has always been about prevention of disease. So it was a lifestyle rather than, something you treat. So that kind of, if we could understand the social philosophy and cultural philosophy that underlies these concepts and thinkings, maybe we would be better aligned with each other in terms of working towards solutions. For example, even with the coronavirus now in the pandemic, we know that many of the peoples whose voices are not prominently, in the media, are the voices of the people who believe that we need to have a holistic approach to health, and what we eat, what we do in terms of our exercises or whatever, those are important too. And our faith in some ways becomes a means by which we can gain spiritual strength. And although these kinds of thinking are important in the Western, more inclusive kind of medicine, as I see it, there is an impulse towards humanities discourses and practices in medicine. These are happening too. And I know that as I came to this country and I saw yoga being practiced by so many people, I was like amazed. I was taken aback, but there is the danger of commercializing practices and ideas that come from outside of our, what I say, US-centric thinking. So let's have that dialogue. It's not comfortable, it's not always helpful for everybody, but we have to have that dialogue. That's all I think.
Thank you, Pushpa. One of the leaders has commented that there seems to be some kind of interplay and confusing overlap of use in the terms colonization and globalization. And it makes the point that we should be emphasizing decolonizing, but not deglobalizing. Any comments on that?
I think for me, it's always the question of what's the motivation, what is the driving force, what are the objectives, whether it is globalization or colonization in the negative and the positive. It's always a question of what people do with it. And I think that almost everything can come to a very negative counterproductive use, or can come into a very productive and forward-looking use. So I think that labels should not hide what else is possible with the agencies and with the resources that we work.
I would echo that. I'll stop. I would echo that.
I just want to also say that, the tendency has been the move from, as in capitalism, from monopoly capitalism to multicultural or multinational capitalism. Capitalism is still there. So we need to be cognizant of that, so that the politics of domination doesn't have a central part to play in either of these. Of course, colonialism was built on the politics of domination. Globalization, there is the hope and the drive to combat elements that are still there. As I said, colonial hangover is still a reality to many people in many parts of the world, including the US. So,
Thank you. Pushpa, we may ask you to give, if it's okay with you, to use some of the book recommendations you make, and we'll have them referenced on our website, the Emory Global Health Institute, because a number of people you have encouraged them, and they look interesting, and people are eager to spend more time reading through some of them. So that would be great. And of course, we'll have a new book coming out from Abda on Cambridge Press as well. So there's a lot to read and to learn about this. There's a number of books on the history that John Blevins gave as well, on the Rockefeller as donors, and the Rockefeller Foundation and the China Medical Board for those interested in that. As I wrap up, Harmy, do you have comments that you'd like to make to the group?
Why don't you wrap up, and then I'll close if you have any closing comments, Jeff.
Just that we recognize that in the time we've got, we can barely touch the surface of this complex but fascinating and extremely important topic. And it's a pleasure to have had such three knowledgeable people with important perspectives to offer on global health, and on colonization, globalization. And it's good to have elements of this in an academic setting as well, because the theories and the kind of political interface with religion and culture are well handled here. And this is a good place to have those discussions. And I'd like to thank the panelists for their participation, taking their time to do this, and the work they do every day. And all who've listened in on the broadcast, I hope you've enjoyed it and gotten something out of it as well. It makes me hungry for more information. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Sachdev, who can maybe offer us some more sessions like this.
Yeah, so again, I'd just like to echo a thanks to all our panelists and the moderator for your participation. Sorry about this. And really thanks to all the participants for joining us on this journey. Just some housekeeping. If you would like to have more, we're going to take a a 5-minute break to kind of log off, and then you can re-log on to a breakout session. So we're going to basically take registrants and we're going to go into small Zoom breakouts to really digest some more of this information in a more intimate setting. So we invite you to participate in that. And as was mentioned, please visit our website, globalhealth.emory.edu, for recordings of this webinar, our previous webinars, and to register for our next event in February. So with that, take care and thanks for joining us.